So one of this year's most popular boomer shooters is a game called Warhammer 40k Bolt Gun, developed by Auroch Digital. It is a game influenced by old school classics like Doom and Quake, and its sales exceeded 1 million during its first 3 days on Steam. And while life hasn't been easy for Warhammer 40k video game fans, with a few hits and a lot of misses along the way, partly due to the fact that Games Workshop licenses the IP out to basically anyone who wants to take a shot at it. Fortunately, however, Bolt Gun is not one of those games. In fact, it might be the only 40k game that actually encapsulates just how violent and gory the weaponry in the 41st millennium actually is. And during the game's roughly 10-hour run, you will not only dodge Terminator fire, you will also be mowing down endless hordes of infectious nurglings and Chaos Space Marines, all while reading up on the good word of the God Emperor of mankind. Because as we all know, in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there's only war. The game is set after 2011's Warhammer 40k Space Marine, and it follows Ultramarine Malum Cato, who is the latest recruit to an elite squad of combatants that just want to see everything die. And if you thought the Doom guy was crazy, old Malum here takes on great unclean ones like he's Will Smith at a rock concert, voiced by the perfectly splendid Rahul Kohli, and with a name that literally translates to I kill evil. The game is off to a great start as an Inquisitor who is basically the 40k universe secret police, except way more fanatical, sends us to the planet of Graia to investigate what appears to be chaos activity. Apparently, a rogue element of Toaster Boys within the Adeptus Mechanicus have been experimenting with a fragment of a power source, which we are sent to find. And in true 40k fashions, there are more threats than available Space Marines, so only a small squad gets sent down to the surface. And after crash landing, your fellow Space Marines obviously die, leaving only Malum Cato and his Service Skull companion to take on the enemies of mankind. However, being the only survivor on a chaos-infected planet isn't going to stop a Space Marine from fulfilling his duty, and from the minute you drop down, you're on a non-stop quest to purge heretics. Now the game is pretty light on story, and most of the exposition is done by the Service Skull, which I have to admit I almost never read what he said, because the text is so far off screen, and with everything going on, there's almost never any time to focus on it anyway. Luckily though, you don't need to care too much for it, as you'll be having too much fun blasting heretics away. Each chapter also comes with a cutscene as a reward, and the story basically boils down to a chaos sorcerer called Tumulus Samael, who is trying to get to the power fragment before you do, in order to stew up some warp spaghetti, and it's up to you to stop him. Now, I've seen a lot of people giving up on the game because the beginning is too easy, and part of the appeal of boomer shooters is the difficulty of the 1990s, which I think is a bit unfair, because while the game does lean more towards power fantasy, the difficulty really does ramp up the further along you get. For example, in the opening mission, Chaos Marines will taunt you by laughing at you, leaving them vulnerable to being shot at. But as the game progresses, the difficulty increases, and by the end of the game, with the things Malum survives, you'd think he was blessed by Khorne himself. Like seriously, I thought this game would follow a regular Space Marine on a mission killing Chaos Space Marines and other lesser demons, so imagine my surprise when a goddamn Lord of Change suddenly appeared. Now the basic premise of the levels is that you need to find keys to unlock doors that allow you to progress, and while you're running around, something called a purge zone can appear, where chaos entities start spawning and it's your job to clear them out in order to continue. And in your arsenal you have the Holy Bolt Gun, which, to quote a famous Australian, was made by a humble man called the
God Emperor of mankind.
And it will serve as your bread and butter weapon throughout the game. And this weapon is one of my favorite weapons in any fictional universe, just because it perfectly showcases the kind of universe that they live in, where a super soldier the size of 2 Venoms clad in power armor needs to fire literal missiles that turn enemies into red mist just in order to combat the most basic of threats. And what's even better is that with hidden ammo upgrades like Dragonfire or Vengeance rounds, the weapon is sure to be useful all the way towards the end of the campaign. Then there's also the shotgun, which does what you'd expect, while sounding like it packs the punch of the Emperor himself. And then there's of course the other more well-known Space Marine weapons like the plasma gun, that, while not the best gun in the game, can still take chunks of armor of enemies and is all around useful as a backup weapon. In fact, all the special weapons are useful in their own way and can take down enemies like it's no business. And the way that they balance this is by having ammo for them being a bit more scarce, and these weapons can be truly brutal. For example, there's the Volkite caliber that literally cooks Terminators so badly that they start spewing blood out of their reinforced ceramite armor. And I just don't know if there's ever going to be a more metal game than this. There's also a similar weapon called the Grav Cannon that creates a gravity field that turns enemies' weights against them and absolutely wrecks anything caught in it. And it is cleverly introduced in a room where you get pretty messed up if you don't use it to clear everything, as it is in a very small area towards the end of the game. The Meltagun is just OP as hell and will get you out of most situations. It's basically a shotgun that just melts through enemies and there's almost nothing that can withstand it. Even a beefy enemy like the Amble get absolutely shredded by it. And then there's the Vengeance Launcher that fires sticky grenades, and I mean, you know the drill. And then there's my favorite weapon, the Heavy Bolter, that just rips everything to shreds while sounding like the goddamn world is ending. If you absolutely want to just annihilate everything around you, there really isn't a better option. In general though, there's not a weapon that is not fun to use, and since the game uses a system where your weapon has a strength that is either higher or lower than an enemy's toughness, it means you can use all of the weapons in different situations, and it's a great way to give variety and spice things up. And of course, no Space Marine game would be complete without the chainsaw, which locks on to targets and slices them up and can be used to conserve ammo and take out small enemies, while also being effective at damaging bigger units as well, which is certainly useful towards the end as ammo gets scarcer as arenas get longer and fights are more prolonged. There are also secrets that can be found throughout the game, which includes run-of-the-mill upgrades like infinite ammo, but also the aptly named Emperor's Visage, which raises contempt, which is essentially the game's version of armor. And then there's also the badass vortex grenade that just absolutely shreds everything in its path, and is definitely one to keep in your spare pocket, just in case. Now, while the game is a boomer shooter, its developers have been quick to point out that they do in fact use modern AI behavior, and for the most part, they work. However, there's several spots where you're supposed to fight really tough and beefy enemies, but you can sort of just shoot at them from a distance without them really reacting or knowing what to do. Thankfully though, those instances are few and far between, but when they do happen, it's kind of jarring. However, in order to make up for it, there's actually a fairly decent variety of enemies that get introduced, even with only 2 Chaos Gods and a few Black Legionnaires represented. You get different types of beefy enemies with Terminators firing at you and Ambles charging into you whenever they get the chance, along with Sorcerers and some flying enemies appearing courtesy of Siege. You got quite the mix going here, and I kinda like it. But then of course no game would be complete without a super annoying enemy, and my personal nemesis is the Aspiring Champions. Enemies who upon being killed just drop to their knees and pray to the Dark Gods in order to ascend and come back even stronger than before, and can be a real pain in small corridors, and they show up a lot during the later parts of the game, creating some really intense and sometimes borderline frustrating moments. And another thing that you will notice is that around the halfway point of the game, you'll start to notice that they stop introducing enemies, and rather they try to make up for it by making purge zones longer and having bigger arenas to fight in. The game also starts to introduce new level mechanics, starting with some simple ones like the floor being lava, and later on jump packs that allow you to maneuver around the level. There's also a level where you need to jump up on pipes and overhangs, adding some much welcomed verticality to the game. And it's also around here that the game starts to become a bit more challenging, because it introduces a lot more tight spaces and close quarter combat, where turning a corner and getting a Chaos Champion in your face can turn into a really frantic fight as you desperately try to get away. And there are just so many fun moments in this game where you enter a cool new area and boom, purge room, and all of a sudden you got a Lord of Change in your face. Like, this game just revels in you taking down the enemies of mankind, and it manages to do so while staying just shy of overstaying its welcome, which is quite a refreshing change from a lot of bigger AAA shooters released recently. The game also has a surprising amount of depth, and once you learn how the enemies work, you can start manipulating them a bit more. For example, I found that Terminators, even at a close range, can be avoided pretty easily by just jumping around in a circle, and I'm sure there's a lot more tricks out there that can be really useful. Now, for us metalheads who are used to Warhammer 40k artwork looking like this, it might feel a bit weird that the game has a more pixelated, WoW-like aesthetic to it, but fear not though, because the game does an absolutely excellent job of portraying the carnage we usually only get to read about in the novels. And being a retro pixel art style game, it comes with the implicit expectation that the game will run well, which it does. It even comes with a pixelation slider that allows you to turn the game into something truly horrific, befitting of the 40k universe. In general, the game has really interesting visuals with warp affected areas and gothic castles that are straight out from the official artwork. The game also reads extremely well considering the frantic pace of the combat, and they really do manage to do a lot with such a quote-unquote simple art style. And while the cutscenes are visually kind of held back due to the pixelated art style, they still manage to convey the atmosphere and story well enough to keep you engaged. The music is dope as hell, and along with the gun's sound design, it all comes together and really leans in on that power fantasy that you're actually playing a 7 feet tall beast that is designed to kill. And while the game is really good, no game is without flaws. And in this game, the AI pathing can be a bit weird at times. Like I said earlier, some rooms allow you to clear enemies from afar without them knowing how to get to you. And this doesn't just affect regular enemies. I even had a Lord of Change get stuck in place at one point. I guess he should be named Lord of Change my pathfinding behavior, which is just a bit hard to swallow considering that the developers themselves pointed out that they do in fact use modern AI behavior. And aside from weird pathing issues, I found that there's quite a bit of places where you get shucked into closed corridors and rooms while a purge zone or otherwise hectic combat is going on, and it's really hard to avoid getting hit while you're moving around. And to make this worse, the damage indicator is barely visible. There's just not a lot of visual effects that make you register that you're actually being hit, and with the amount of projectiles zooming around the room, it'd be nice to have a better indication of when you're actually taking damage. And while the game does start to introduce some light platformer mechanics, I feel like there's just so much more they could have done with it to keep it interesting, because while having a level where the lava keeps rising is a nice change of pace, I just wish that they had done more things like this. For example, there's even a room with lasers, but it doesn't really amount to anything and can definitely be expanded into something bigger, because it really feels like an area where they wanted to try something different, but then it kind of went nowhere and they just kept it. And while I get that there's a limit to how much the developers can do, unless you're making Baldur's Gate 3, it'd be nice with more variety towards the end. And instead of reusing the same old enemies, why not introduce some noise marines or core knight berserkers? Hell, even battling a bloodthirster can make for some interesting boss arenas. Also, running around looking for keys to progress through areas can be a bit annoying at times, and I feel like the mechanic doesn't really add anything to the game. They could have just kept you going forward and focusing on the gameplay instead. But in general though, I only actually encountered one bug where I got stuck inside a banner, which is kind of amazing considering I always end up finding these sort of things. But even with all of these small issues, I'd say it's still an insanely fun and good shooter that really gives you a bang for your buck. And it's rare to see a Warhammer game that is both good and stays true to the feel of the 40k universe. And with Bolt Gun, you're going to get a lot of mileage out of the game. And I feel like it's a game that could be the start of a great series. And I can't wait to see what new enemies they'll introduce in future DLC or a sequel. But anyway, what do you guys think of the game? Leave a comment with your thoughts, and as always, like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.